Marvel wanted a good way to show off their comic potential in movies following the disaster of Howard the Duck, The Punisher is probably not something to produce next. And Marvel must have knew this movie was a bad idea because it took 2 years after being completed for it to be released in America. And the reviews weren't very in favor for this film. But what do I think of it? Well, let's go over the story. Frank Castle is an assassin whose family was blown up by the mob and now spends his days punishing any of the mob leaders under his secret identity, the Punisher. Frank Castle is played by, I don't know, Sylvester Stallone's cousin? Actually, that's right, it's none other than everyone's favorite Russian from Rocky IV. Anyway, Frank's old partner wants to discover who the Punisher is, since the Punisher is killing many mob people, which in any superhero movie where the superhero is doing good, the cops hate. But the Punisher is faced with a new challenge when the mob's children are kidnapped by the Chinese mob, and for some reason the Punisher wants to save the kids and destroy the new mob for good. Will he succeed in the end? Yeah, I can already see the problems with this movie. Not really with the plot, but more about motivation. Like, why does he need to save the mob's children? Does he feel bad because his kids died? The movie never really puts a strong enough reasoning for his motivation, and the characters are never really worked on. Now, don't get me wrong, the characters are all typical stereotypes. You got the guy who wants to revenge for his family's death, the cop who's fallen apart and needs to get back on his feet, the reporter who wants the inside scoop on everything, and the mob who will do anything to keep their power. But the thing about the stereotype is, they're never fully there. The stereotype is sorta shown, but it isn't completely finished. It's like a half stereotype. The character sort of ripped off someone, but then it doesn't fully complete the stereotype. It just kind of halfway goes through it. I don't know how to explain, just know that the characters are generic. Speaking of generic, a lot of plot and action is generic. Like, of course he wants revenge, learns the true meaning of helping others, and travels down his path to save the day. In fact, most of the time it feels like there is no plot. But at the same time, there is some interesting things going on. Like, have you ever seen a movie that looks at the mobster's children and see it from their perspective? Or how about someone who wants revenge but is never told that he needs to be a true hero? He instead just keeps going on with his revenge. Nothing is learned. In fact, there is a line in the movie where he says he'll never give up on the revenge. And the ending, when the Punisher saves the mobster's life from the Chinese leader, the mobster still tries to kill the Punisher. They didn't learn that they should treat the people who saved their own lives with respect. No, he still sees the Punisher as a threat. There is, of course, a number of things I don't like. The acting is, well, besides maybe the lieutenant, the acting is bad. And a number of action scenes I think are too dark of a screen. In fact, the whole film is sort of just a dark blaze. And the ending, when a Chinese lady tries to force the mobster to kill himself, I think it gets a bit too weird, especially when she starts laughing hysterically. The action, while ripping off other films, is fun to watch. It's an 80s way of doing an action film. And yeah, there is a little blood here and there and swearing throughout. It feels kind of like they wanted to make a Die Hard movie, but at the same time, they're ripping off a lot of influence from the Batman movie that was released the same year. And you know what? I kind of like it. It's not amazing, but for what it is, I think it's fun to watch. I don't think Marvel should have moved ahead with this production, but you know what? I'm glad they didn't go and make Spider-Man or the Avengers in the 80s because the effects needed for those films just weren't around yet. For the Punisher though, making a simple shoot-'em-up film, it's alright. If you're into old 80s action flicks, I'd check this out. It gets going right away and keeps you invested throughout, even though it doesn't really have a plot or characterization. If anything, this was refreshing after seeing Howard the Duck. Oh, and to the Punisher fanboys, don't bother with this film. I heard it's very different from the comic. Even the skull doesn't appear. But for fans of good old action effects and action stars, I'd say ignore the reviews and give this a watch. Stay tuned.